Hello, everyone. Welcome to the episode 1 of the Beans and Rice podcast. I'm your host, Benedict Smith, alongside my co-host, Matthew Yang.
Hello.
Matthew, how are you doing?
Very stressed out finals week. How are you doing?
I'm incredibly stressed out as well. Nice to see that we're on the same ground. Now, in today's podcast, this is about specifically a ethnic studies class that we have taken in Chico State University. Shout out to that school, best school west of the Mississippi. But in the spring semester, we took a Chicanos studies class, and me and Matthew, we both were in the class, and we both learned a lot of stuff. What was your thoughts on that class, Matthew?
Personally, it was one of my favorite classes, and I'm not saying that to get brownie points, but it was genuinely one of my favorite classes. It might be because it was my only class on that specific Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I would usually just go to that class all refreshed. I don't have that much friends, so I would just go there, talk, yap my professor's ear off, Dr. G, and definitely one of my favorite classes. How do you feel about it?
Oh, it wasn't my favorite class, but I didn't have any hard feelings about it. I thought it was a nice, refreshing class because they did a lot of speeches, and I'm a political science major. But it's always nice to get something that's not related to those two fields. So, anyways. We've both decided to set up our podcasting because we have been given some prompts by our teacher to answer as sort of a way to reflect over this course and the semester and exactly how we've learned about this class overall. And so in today's episode of this podcast, we'll be discussing the first prompt that we were given by our professor and how exactly we answer that and our thoughts on it. So the first prompt that we've been given that we will be answering and reviewing in this episode will be: reflecting on what you've learned over the course of the semester, discuss how systemic oppression from Spain and the United States influences the experience of Latinos. So, what are your thoughts on this prompt, Matthew?
See, the one thing that automatically comes to mind when you read that prompt out is the more cultural aspect within that type of thing, because of course there's historical context and within all of that may have mounted from that, but I'm not that good at history, but I automatically think on how the Latino and Latina experience has been influenced by those types of cultural things, and how the cultural dominance of the South of Spanish and U.S. imperialism kind of plays into that. How do you feel?
Oh, I'm not too familiar with the cultural aspects of what we've learned, but I am more familiar with the more historical and political ideas that were discussed in this class. The political oppression and the imperialist history that was committed by both the Spanish Empire and the United States that has really influenced the Latin community and remains reflective to this day. And so, we both have a series of sources that we have looked into, or that I think we can best describe to this sort of idea we have, which is that the political oppression and cultural dominance established by both the Spanish and U.S. imperialism that cemented control in the conquered territories in the New World is still prevalent in the Latin community and remains reflective to this day.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
It genuinely feels like those, both the cultural dominance, political oppression, kind of have to combine to create a very reflective and very unique type of experience for Latinos and Latinas. And without one or the other, it necessarily just, yes, it may still influence, but it genuinely does feel like those types of things have to combine to remain unique, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Oh, yeah, it does. This sort of reminds me of a reading that we had done in the class that I'll share out to the audiences. So this was a reading we read in week 2, which is called A Brief History of the Latinx Racial Formations, which was written by Amber Gonzalez. And so this article, or this section of the article, Spanish Conquest, Colonialism, and Batishas, this is focused relatively on the Spanish borderlands that was in the sort of New World, in between Mexico, Texas, California, and New Mexico. It was sort of the borderlands between both the Spanish Empire and the United States. And the article talks about sort of the development of the sort of hybrid culture of the Latin community in the region, because there were the native populations there, such as the Pueblo, and then later on there was also settlements created by Spanish missionaries and by Spanish colonialism. But then later on, during or after independence. And later on, during U.S. imperialism, when the U.S. conquered the region, we saw how the U.S. sort of implemented their own system. So the Spanish Empire had their own system of the caste system there, but then later on, the U.S. also implemented sort of their own like racial ideas of diversity there. And so basically what you ended up having was you had Native Americans that would try and sort of identify themselves more as Spanish American to avoid persecution by the United States. And then you also have Latinos living in the region try and push for a more Spanish American identity in the region to try and avoid the sort of nativist and white supremacist ideas that were inflicting violence and discrimination in these communities. I think that this sort of reflects what we've been talking about, how the political oppression that was created by both the Spanish Empire and the United States in that region would end up reflecting the development of these Latino communities in the region. What are your thoughts, Matthew?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was a lot to take in.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the most highlighted things is, can you expand more on like the caste system, what that was?
Oh, yeah. So the caste system, well, the Spanish caste system was essentially the division of people by skin color and sort of their class. So at the top of the class, you had pure-blooded Spaniards that came from back home from the mainland, who were seen as like had the most rights and were the most elite of the group. Then in the middle, you had various people who were sort of mixed, like they were mixed race with the native populations, and so they ended up like having some rights, but they were seen more as like the middle class. And then in the lower class, you had sort of the native and enslaved African Americans who were seen as like the cannon fodder of the society. So that's what I would mean by that.
Yeah, I feel like the whole like caste system and the whole pure blood type of thing, that like the whole idea of it kind of well, my personal thing is it mirrors Harry Potter, but we can get back to that another point. I genuinely do feel like the whole caste system and pure blood thing type of does qualify for like the whole political oppression. That if, like you said, that if you're not seen as pure blood and you're not white passing and all of these things, and you don't favor your white identity and all of those things, you're more likely to receive less, not even more likely, you are going to receive a lot less rights. And I feel like this whole brings up the whole this whole thing that's somewhat mentioned in Harry Potter, and I really wish they've expanded upon it, is like purebloods. If the audience is very is very familiar, there you go, with the whole Muggles and pureblood things, for a quick summary is that Muggles, or humans who don't have any hint of magic within their bloodline, are capable of producing wizard children, but at the same time, you're also seen as like a mudblood and someone who doesn't really deserve to be a wizard or a witch or all of those things. And I feel like it's very similar to what you said. Oh,
yeah, I can see that as well. There's also the aspect of like in the wizarding world, it related back to, there was like a subplot about the elves, with like Dobby as a character in Harry Potter, and like how they were being used by the wizarding people in the world, and Hermione trying to sort of stop the enslavement of these groups. So I can also relate back to that as well.
Yeah, I feel like this whole thing kind of amounts to what you mentioned it about how some people might choose to identify with their whole Caucasian or white counterpart, or like their white side of the family, because it's just bound to give them more rights, which of course is oof. And another one is just like, I feel like this whole thing just amounts to trying to oppress a specific rigid type of identity. And it again kind of mirrors, and I feel like this whole adds up to a source that I feel like that Dr. G mentioned in one of the lectures, is in the week 4 slides, the what is critical Latinx studies, particularly slides 3 through 11, really remind me of those types of things. A quick summary of that is that what those slides are talking about is critical race theory, or more specifically, Lat Crit. And Lat Crit is more of a specific type of genre within critical race theory, if you know what that is. And it's how like the oppression and the education system is more favorable towards Caucasian and white passing peers compared to darker skin tone or Latino and Latina Latino and Latina people. And Lat Crit talks about how specifically that critical race theory affects that community. And another one that the slides like to talk about is machismo marianismo. I'm not going to go too much into it because that's a whole other thing. But machismo marianismo is, I feel like, does amount from oppression. This one doesn't necessarily talk about the roots within machismo marianismo, but a whole quick summary is that machismo rose from something alongside of the caste system, what you said, right? And I genuinely do feel like it talks about all of those things. Like, machismo was used as a way of oppression. So how do you feel about like machismo marianismo?
I think you bring up a very good point. I think it relates back to the cultural dominance we were talking about with the legacy of Spanish colonialism. And, you're talking about roots there. And, that brings up a very interesting point about like where those ideas stem from. And so, for where those ideas stem from, I see it from history. Like, would you like to expand more on like what you were just talking about?
Yeah. I feel like the biggest part of this is how all that adds up to Lat Crit. And for example, what you said about the whole caste system also adds up to Lat Crit. How Lat Crit is how many like oppression and all this oppression, all this like harmful things and stereotypes and all of these like things that were made like in the caste system within history are never truly discussed within the education system. And people often had to primarily focus on, oh wow, look at our amazing culture and food, which personally, as a very cultural person, irks me. But yeah, I don't know. I just feel like all of that is sort of the whole caste system and choosing to identify with the whole being seen as a pureblood from Harry Potter and being seen as a pureblood and whole Lat Crit just all amounts to feeling like you're not necessarily welcome within the American society,
Okay, yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I think this would be a good time to, sort of expand more on the background of the issue we've talked about, because we've talked a lot about the caste system, and we gave a brief description of it, but I think we can go more in detail about it. And specifically, there was slides from the Week 2 lecture that had gone into the caste system under Spanish colonialism, and I'll go through that briefly to explain it. Now, the Spanish caste system that was used by the Spanish colonial empire was essentially used to rank people in social standing. Now, as I've gone through, there were basically many different social classes in this like sort of pyramid, but you could essentially divide all those classes into 3 class systems in the caste system. So at the top, there were what was considered as pure-blooded Spaniards, the peninsulars, that were seen as having the most rights as they were the most pure-blooded and most inclined with the mainland of Spain. And then in the middle of the hierarchy, you had the mixed race society. This included the various hodgepodge of native, of black, and of actual Spaniards that had interbred in these new societies and had created a mixed race in the new society of the Spanish Empire. And these groups were seen as having like some rights within the Spanish society, but they weren't seen as being equal to actual Spaniards. And then all the way at the bottom, you had what were considered as the indigenous and enslaved people of the New World, which were the Native Americans and the enslaved African Americans that were transported from Africa. And they were seen as having no rights whatsoever and having no like blood rights to the land. And so speaking about the caste system and how it has influenced the development of culture, the caste system was in place for hundreds of years in Spanish society. Spain ruled over the New World for centuries up until the 19th century. And then even after the Spanish Empire had effectively ended, by such, the caste system and how it had ingrained the society around it would still remain and linger. And, many people see the caste system as sort of being the backbone for what has fueled, like colorist sentiments or anti-black attitudes in various South American countries. What are your thoughts on that, Matthew?
Yeah, that the caste system I really, really hated. But that's a whole nother rant and another thing. I feel like this whole amounts to the whole identity thing. And the whole caste system kind of again creates a whole hierarchy, which is again, very prevalent within Harry Potter. And also, even it's so weird that something in fiction can also parallel something within the real world, you know? And I feel like when something mirrors that, you should probably wonder, oh, this is probably something we need to unpack. And it's very prevalent. I know a peer of mine who would rather choose to identify as white when she was applying to college because she had a bigger chance of getting accepted. So that itself, she was Latina, and that itself is just the caste system at work.
Oh, yeah. I could sort of see that as well. In my college applications, I'm, for the audiences who are wondering, I am mixed. My father was Anglo-American, but my mom is Filipino. And so when I was applying for college applications, it was sort of a bit confusing because, is Filipino considered like being Hispanic? Is it considered more Asian? Would I put myself as mixed? Would I put myself as white? Very confusing questions as to how do you sort of identify yourself.
Yeah, and I feel like I feel like I'm talking about identity a lot, but I can talk about it forever if needed to. But I feel like this whole again adds up with another source. I mentioned machismo marianismo in the past, like a couple minutes ago. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Dr. G, thank God sent, she talks about it in the Week 13 Chicano Latinx slides, Decolonizing Sexism, Heterosexism, and Cisgenderism, slides 7 through 12. They specifically discuss what machismo marianismo is. Machismo is parallel to toxic masculinity within the Western world. And marianismo is more of the feminine and the more feminine counterpart of machismo. So marianismos Latinas are expected to be more submissive and the ability to be more self-sacrificing compared to their male counterpart, while their male counterpart must be head of the family, dominant, good at super confident, good at handy stuff, very practical. It creates this whole harmful thing of needing to fit in within a really rigid thing,
Yeah, with social norms and gender roles as such.
Yeah, I feel like those types of things again add up to identity and are never discussed within Lat Crit. And Lat Crit is a subgenre of critical race theory, and all of that amounts to critical race theory never being discussed in education systems. So because of that, I feel like this is all kind of cause and effect type of thing. Because of that, critical race theory and the ability and willingness to talk about machismo, marianismo is just never discussed within children.
Yeah, okay. That's a very interesting point you brought up there. And so, in thinking about all this, I think more of in a broader sense of how sort of the political oppression. We've been talking a lot more about the cultural aspects of it and more of an individual with colorism and the caste system. But I want to look at things more on much more broader scale with more of the political systems that have caused the influence of the Latino communities and how they developed today. And so one specific source from our lectures that we have read was from Week 6, or actually from a reading that I've done, which was published by Gonzalez, which was about, or a book that he has published, and specifically a chapter titled Banana Republics and Bonds, Taming the Empire's Backyard. And this article specifically goes into the U.S. foreign policy and U.S. economic policy within the region of Central America and the Caribbean, countries like Cuba, Honduras, El Salvador. And so, it specifically talks about how American imperialism played a crucial role in influencing these countries that the people lived in. Obviously, there was economic exploitation by U.S. companies, specifically to focus on produce, such as obviously bananas, which is what the article is talking about, but also talking about U.S. foreign policy and how it was specifically developed to benefit these sort of countries. And the way I tie it back into the idea of political oppression being established by U.S. imperialism and being prevalent in these Latino communities is that the political oppression of these people purely for U.S. economic interests sort of degrades who these people are as being little more than tools within the grand scheme of things. So for U.S. businesses, corporations, and U.S. businessmen, the Central America was purely viewed as an economic resource, a place that you grow produce that you can export to other countries or grow for in markets. But it saw the complete disregard of these communities or the people that they had basically enslaved, like not actually enslaved, but more like politically annexed to sort of exploit for labor for these markets. And so you can sort of see it as being tied to basically degrading these Latin communities as being like little more than cattle, as being for resource extraction, rather than being as individuals or for cultural or any sort of that sense. What are your thoughts on that, Matthew?
One of the biggest things you talked about was the whole cattle thing. It's very dehumanizing. And when I think about like cattle, I think of cows who are constantly being taken advantage of.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And like U.S. Cattle farms, like industrial slaughtering machines.
Yeah, and if you've been to industrial farms, it's not the best conditions.
Yeah. So you can make that parallel with like these communities under American imperialism in these countries. They were basically being exploited, and they weren't seen as people, as like these people in their own countries with their own culture, their own language, and their own ideas of identity or customs. But they were seen a little more as like a resource that could be used to exploit purely for economic gain for U.S. interests.
Talking about economic gain, I feel like that whole thing talks about, or like is kind of similar to another reading called it's the week 8 reading from Bernard, and it's titled "The Time a President Deported 1 Million Mexican Americans for Supposedly Stealing U.S. Jobs" and everything. It's about 2 pages. It's amazing reading. Within that article or within that reading, it talks about how many Mexicans were scapegoated and were seen as like bad for the economy, and like U.S. citizens who were born in Mexican Americans were constantly being deported and were being scapegoated. And goat cattle. that's a random connection, but that's what I think of. But they were scapegoated within all of that, and I feel like this whole, again, this is more of like a economic type of thing, but I feel like they're not only taken advantage of financially and they are taken advantage of to gain more money and capitalistic, but they're also taken advantage of as scapegoats. And if as soon as we no longer need them, they can just be deported, like dropped, dehumanized, just like a cow, and just like how cattle is only made for food and random materials. As soon as they're not useful, just dropped.
Oh, yeah. I also looked into the source that you talked about. It goes into, like Herbert Hoover, it goes a lot into the Great Depression. And so obviously during a time of immense economic crisis, when people were losing their jobs, banks were basically collapsing in on themselves, and the U.S. financial sector was falling in on itself. And rather than it sort of being a time for unity with the people who were struggling during this time to try and gain momentum, simply these people were used as a scapegoat by the government to try and save themselves, not only for the political purpose for re-election, but also to try and keep a sense of stability in the financial sector or with the domestic policy.
Yeah, I genuinely just feels like this kind of connects back to what you said about the whole political dominance and cultural oppression, about how the U.S. and all of that remained politically dominant, And I'm not as skilled within all the whole political things, but I genuinely do feel like this connects back to how many Mexican Americans were taken advantage of and are still being taken advantage of, farm workers and everything. And I just feel like all of this just creates such an isolating experience for people today, to the point where they need to feel like they need to be hardworking, or they just do all of that. And I don't know. It just irks me a lot. Oh,
yeah. I can also see that in Asian American communities. My mom is Filipino, so she had high expectations for me and my brothers about that. So you can also see that correlated with Asian Americans who had immigrated to the U.S. with the same as Mexican Americans who were either in the country or had immigrated. And speaking of of political oppression and talking about like the economic subjugation that was done during this time, I think it would also be a relevant point to bring up specifically U.S. foreign policy that also relates to the corporate imperialism done by the United States, which I found from the week 6 of the lectures, specifically from slide 12. And this was specifically what was called the Roosevelt corollary. I'm not very good with sounding out words.
Do you mean corollary?
Corollary, yeah. You don't need to correct me. But anyways, what the Roosevelt corollary is that it was essentially the extension of the Monroe Doctrine. So if you don't know, the Monroe Doctrine was basically U.S. foreign policy, which stated that they themselves were in complete control of the New World, or they were the protectors of the New World, and they would prevent any form of new imperialism done by the old world powers, England, France, Spain. And so while on the surface it might seem like a good thing where they're trying to protect these nations, what it could also be seen was that it was sort of the U.S. positioning themselves to take advantage of these countries, or to set itself up as the imperialist country of the New World. And we saw this later happen during the 1900s with the Roosevelt corollary. But yeah, it was essentially this idea created by President Roosevelt that the U.S. could intervene in Latin American countries who would not obey, or who would not, quote, obey the primary laws of civil society. And so what this would end up happening was that it was used as a justification for the U.S. to intervene, whether economically or politically, in countries that were not seen or aligned with it. There was obviously with the Dominican Republic, then there was with Nicaragua, and then there was also with U.S. economic and foreign policy, whether this was in terms of like a country's debt or a country being forced to use U.S. currency to repay loans, or whether it was starting military occupations to protect its economic interests. And so you can tie this back to, again, the people in these countries, as we spoke about earlier with our earlier talking points, but the people in these countries and the Latin communities living in them, they were not seen as, again, individuals. These countries that were ran by these people did not have the free will to decide themselves, to decide how their communities would develop, what was best in their best interest for their communities and their politics and their people, but it was rather subjugated by U.S. foreign policy. It was, again, more about what the U.S. wanted in terms of economic and political gain, rather than about the humanitarian idea of what these communities wanted or what these communities needed at all. So what are your thoughts on that, Matthew?
Yeah, there's a lot of information, I'm going to be honest. I suck at history, but I feel like the whole being seen as like the protector, it kind of, this talks of a whole other thing, but I feel like it kind of talks about like, do you know what the white man's burden is, Ben?
Yeah, it was, well, I don't remember specifically, but it was basically about this idea that it was essentially sort of Anglo-American countries. It was their goal to, quote, civilize the unruly world that had to do with like darker skinned people.
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to like the whole white man's burden type of thing, being seen, the America being seen as the protector, what the hell? What even is that? Like, I feel like, yeah, sure, America might be more progressed and might have a lot more, like, might have some more materials. I don't think you need to be financially dependent. I feel like to me, it creates like this whole codependent type of thing, you know?
Yeah.
But I also feel like that relates to another one. It's not necessarily as related, but many activists talk about it. One of my favorite being Gloria. I can't pronounce her last name, so I'm not even going to try, to be honest. But Gloria, she writes a book, or not even, she talks about it in one of the readings that Dr. G assigned. It was called, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pronounce this correctly. It's like the La Conciencia de la Mestiza, or towards a new conscience and everything. And of course, it doesn't talk about like the specific history, but she's an activist, and she talks about like the whole intersectionality within the Latino community and everything, and being queer and being a woman, and all of that. And I feel like that kind of could be affected by the history that you talked about. What do you think?
I think, yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, these are very different topics. With the last one, we just talked about like foreign policy and all that, and this is completely different to that. But I think that you can still pull similar ideas from these two sources about the overall, like the broader idea of these Latino communities.
Yeah, I feel like the political oppression and cultural dominance kind of go hand in hand within each other, you know? And they basically produce like a very, very deep-rooted things that remain, like customs and behaviors and expectations that are harmful to many children and adults and Latinos and Latinas, like all those people. All of that amounts to just it feeling like alone, and how, yes, they're custom behaviors, but since they're so like normalized and everything, no one really talks about it. How that history, like the whole caste system and the whole Roosevelt corollary that the U.S. is seeing as a protector, but proceeds to deport 1 million Mexican Americans because they don't need to be taken advantage of anymore, makes no sense. But regardless, I do feel like those things go hand in hand. That without political oppression, you don't have cultural dominance. And without cultural dominance, political oppression necessarily fails.
Yeah, as we're beginning to wrap up, we've gone through the various amount of sources that were used throughout the lecture of this class of the spring semester. And, while these sources, they're very different ideas, like we've gone through foreign policy, political oppression, and economic policy, and what in hand with cultural ideas and cultural oppression, while they aren't like toe to toe, they're not like one size fits all issue. They both still very much connect to each other, and you can pull the same ideas about how they have influenced the Latino community over centuries, from a very broad concept such as the caste system that goes all the way down to, colorist sentiments,
Yeah.
And so, with that being said, I think we've gone through very much about Prompt 1 and the idea, which is that with the political oppression and cultural dominance established by the Spanish and U.S. imperialism, which is still prevalent in the Latino community and remains reflective to this day.
Yeah.
And so I think will be the wrap-up of episode 1 of the Beans and Rice podcast.
Once again, this is Benedict Smith.
Yeah, that's me.
And Matthew Yank.
As co-hosts. We thank you all very much, and we'll see you on episode 2.